the podium, is it called. We may cut into the coffee break a little bit, but presumably you can hang in there with us for some questions. Is that all right? Okay.
Don't cut it short.
Yeah, because this is an all-star panel.
Yep.
And excluding me. And delighted that Øystein could join us for that example of how, I mean, here's a ship owner who took the lead in creating something that worked for them, because not all the tools and models are out there really, but we can create them. And that's the kind of ingenuity, innovation, and collaboration that everybody from Peter Thompson yesterday, who kicked off our Ship Zero forum, to Michael and other speakers have pointed out is the key to navigating us through this. So let me ask about transparency, because this comes up. We're being measured. All these things have to be measured. These are not aspirational statements underway anymore. And the AER metric has been mentioned, and emissions in general as currency really have been mentioned as driving this forward. So maybe for each of the panelists, can you tell us what is the limit on who are you measuring for in each case? And secondly, can we really, who are we trusting to deliver data, as a third-party verifier? Because that's what's going to really drive the comfort level of institutional investors in particular, who haven't been fans of the shipping industry in the past, but now are coming in the Outfell example. 40%, I think you said, of your investors maybe were new to this sector, and we're in there because of the sustainability features. So maybe could you mention that quickly, and then Michael, Paul, and Greg, for each of your perspectives, tell us about the metrics you're using and who's going to use them and how they might evolve over the next couple of years.
I'll kick off. I mean, as Paul mentioned, we're using AER because the IMO uses that for the DCS regulation. What we wanted to do is not to make assumptions. We wanted to use existing metrics that had been announced, if you like, by the global regulator. And we know that's going to change. So we know by 2023, or certainly by 2026, there'll probably be a new metric, AER and EEOI somehow combined. And as Paul said, we will evolve our metric to that. I think what is different, and if you look at all the accounting scandals, you have to say, well, what were the auditors actually doing when they looked at some of those companies? This is actually about the real world as opposed to the way you calculate numbers. So today there is technology being trialed by the US Coast Guard and others that will stream live emissions from the stack of a ship. Currently CO2, they will add methane and other stuff. So that data, if that's a reliable, it's going to be it's part of the public good. Everyone, from environmentalists to consumers to bank regulators to shareholders, is going to be wanting to use that data. And we know that data is, what drives the world these days. But this has to be reliable. It has to be regulated in the sense that governments accept it. That's important. The role of the classification societies, I think, here is crucial. Their neutrality in all this helps us to, from the outside, if you like, to say these are standards we can follow. So you haven't seen half of it yet. In fact, you've seen less than 1% of what we're going to see in emissions data. And as I said, every single piece of cargo will have emissions data. I was on a ABS sustainability panel last week with Jeremy Nixon, who's the CEO of Ocean Network Express, and someone from Boston Consulting. And I challenged Jeremy to whether he was ready for a consumer to want to be able to pick which pink container on his pink ships to move the goods they'd ordered from Singapore or wherever it was. He can't do that now, but that may be what comes. The consumers will actually simply be choosing how the good gets to them down to quite a micro level.
Thank you. Paul, Greg, would you like to make a comment on that?
Am I good?
Yeah.
Am I on? Yeah. Well, just following on from what Michael said, so the AER is available data. The shipping companies are already giving this information this data to the IMO. It's regulatory regulatory requirement. So it's available, it's consistent, it's easy to calculate. So it's right we go with that at the moment. It will evolve. It'll be very interesting if it's used and to create the CII, which I think once you get this rating A to E, will have some very interesting ramifications for financing of vessels. Today signatories can calculate the AER themselves. They can use a third party. We favour a third party at SocGen. I think it creates a form of auditing and consistency, but banks can calculate it themselves. The classification societies are playing a major role in that, and I think increasingly going forwards. And what's quite interesting with the classification societies, with the AER, is that not only are they either calculating the AER or checking the bank's AER, they're also providing additional services now through tracking the vessels. They can give their view on why individual vessels may be scoring badly or well, whether they're aligned or misaligned, and they go further and to actually propose certain retrofits that can be done for them to be aligned going forwards. And the issue there is how to communicate that with the ship owners, because they tend not to like banks running their business for them. So it's how we communicate that knowledge, that information to ship owners that going forward that's going to be crucial.
Yes.
Sorry, I just want to ask, can I say, when you use an acronym, that you actually explain the acronym, because I'm thinking not everybody in the room, it's okay, I've got my, not everybody in the room might understand AER and CII, and thank you very much.
Yeah, that's good, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Greg, in blended finance, here you're running a range. Let's just talk about the developing world, for instance.
Yeah, I think shipping's got the advantage of being relatively uniform in classification. So I'll give you an example which is not shipping, which gives you a good example of how it becomes difficult. So we did a review for the EIB recently on their climate action bond program, and we spoke to all the
EIB, European
rangers.
Investment Bank.
Sorry, European Investment Bank, and spoke to all the leader rangers, the big investment banks, the big brokers, the big investment managers, and there was a big dichotomy between the US and Europe in terms of definition of what's green and what's not. Now, US doesn't have a taxonomy per se, and it started to become clear under the EU taxonomy, but the example of a power purchase agreement and how it could form part of a use of proceeds bond. Now, it's acceptable generally within the psychology of the USA, but not in the EU under the EU taxonomy. And the reason is that if a corporate buys renewable energy, and part of the money that is being raised to fund the purchase of that renewable energy over time, that would theoretically be acceptable for a US leader ranger, but under the EU taxonomy, it doesn't qualify. There are other things like what is the role of gas, and do no significant harm. These are things that aren't completely agreed by all parties internationally, and there is a much more inflexible, more rigorous use of proceeds allocation under the EU taxonomy than there is in a lot of other parts of the world. So I'm not entirely sure how it affects shipping, but because of the annual efficiency ratio, is the correct acronym, it's probably easier to have very robust data and a clear agreed format for reporting than it is in a number of the other industries.
Yeah, true, that's an advantage. I want to ask, here, Austin, I'll give you a chance on this question also, about the price of money. So I'm a little confused because blended finance is needed to solve these barriers, particularly for new technologies and the developing world, and that's designed to bring private capital in without crowding out the traditional financiers too. So that's a dance there. And yet we're talking here, Odfjell, a big ship owner, we had heard from Ardmore yesterday and others that are significant players, yet we heard a lot of innovations yesterday too that are early stages needing access to capital. What's the price now for these new technologies, unproven, yet everybody says they want to be on this pathway going forward? Can a new technology for an Odfjell or for one of the developers get attractive, affordable finance some way through one of these mechanisms, through the cargo, the collaborations we talked about yesterday, or is it through public money only? What are the ways that might happen, that the price may become affordable to get to these more ambitious goals? Who would like to answer?
So do you want?
Oystein, yeah. And you're looking at a price trigger that might, depends on your achieving your goals.
Okay, I get a little bit echo here, and That works. Okay. Thank you for the question. I would just also like to touch upon the initial question about the transparency. I think that we look at our reporting and performance as a value, and we see the benefit, and we see also a competitive advantage for us with our performance and reporting. So that's why we want to report on that one, and we will release our Q3 numbers tomorrow actually. And in our quarterly reporting this year, we have a reporting with to the financial market our AER performance. So AER is the kind of emission divided on the ton mile, compared to the EEOI, which is the kind of divided on the ton mile and cargo. So EEOI presents a more footprint of the cargo, and AER gives a footprint on the vessel and the fleet, and so that's the kind of difference in order to try to explain that. So important in order to be transparent is the data collection. So we have in our company, we have spent a lot of time improving data quality and making sure that data is available. And that means that we were able to set ambitious targets. That means that we are able to do our fleet transition plan. And it means that it's possible for us to report to the market. And we also see that the market responds positively to that, because we see that we are, when we are competing against others, we see that our performance is good. So when we selected a third-party verificator for the sustainability linked bond, we selected DNVGL to do that, because we know that they have a strong name within the shipping. We could have selected any kind of certified verifier. It could be one of the big fours, it could be Sustainalytics, it could be others, but in order to making sure that the financial market understand its product and also could give confidence that our fleet transition plan was ambitious, that it's a highly ambitious strategy. We wanted to make sure that we onboarded a verificator that really knows the business. So that was the background for transparency. So we support transparency, and I will encourage everyone also to look at what we have reported on our website through our ESG reporting and also the other reporting. With regards to the pricing, so that is it's kind of the question that you never really get the perfect answer to. So what we experienced by linking our bond, and what we have done recently is also we see that when we did that, our share price went up the day we released that. We see that our other bonds are trading more following that. So we see a lot of good kind of spin-offs and spillover to equity as well. So, but the fact that we got it substantially oversubscribed, get a push on the price. So whether that price would be, what the difference, what it would be, and if was a plain vanilla or bond compared to sustainability linked bond, we will never get a perfect answer to that. But I think that we saw a lot of benefits to that, and I think that will be growing also going forward, because I think that financing will see that adding ambitious climate targets should be also included in the credit risk process. So that will be also a part of that. So for us, with regards to the pricing, as you mentioned, and the different technology, it could be possible that we could do dedicated financing, let's say like a green bond or green use of proceeds kind of financing for a new vessel. That could be possible, but for the different technology and retrofits that we are doing, we will do that under the general financing that we are doing as a part of that sustainability linked bond. I would also say that after we issued that, we have also issued all the loans that we have issued, that we have done after the sustainability linked bond, will also a sustainability linked loan with the different banks.
Yes, thank you, Michael.
Well, I'm not going to directly answer your question, but this is where data is so important. When we drafted the Poseidon Principles, the CEO of one of the largest tanker companies wanted carrots and sticks. We talked about that on our table yesterday afternoon. What data will enable is bigger carrots and bigger sticks, so that good behavior or good performance is rewarded and commitments that are not made are therefore punished. And of course, pricing is one way of doing that. The second thing is, I think, we passed the $2 trillion of sustainable bonds having been issued last month. And that's up from $1 trillion in November 2020. This market is growing. There will become a point where no financing is not sustainable. and that goes to the availability of capital. And so whilst there will be brownfield financing, that will of course become more expensive because it will work against the net zero targets. Those net zero targets are going to apply to investors. As an issuer, an underwriter of bonds, we are going to be judged on our underwriting performance in terms of emissions as much as our own capital. And the third point, which is very important and why the data is so important, is we, the banks, are the regulated financial sector. We need our regulators, particularly the central banks and the Basel team, if you like, to change the capital ratios to help encourage green financing. This is a climate change issue. Central banks don't sit in Basel or somewhere else and somehow immune to this. But we need the banks to argue with their regulators to get it, but they will need the data to come up with the structures that will allow us to lend without being penalized in a capital sense from taking the sort of risk on innovation in this topic.
Yeah. Paul, would you add to that?
Yeah, just to pick up on that last point, I mean, at the moment it's very difficult. Clients quite rightly are looking for the carrot, and they're looking for incentivized pricing, and it's just not possible at the moment to give material discounts in pricing for sustainable or green loans, unless a bank just wants to take it out of its own profit margin. Then of course it can do what it likes. But until the capital charge, the capital cost of banks is cheaper for sustainable deals, it will always be, these sustainability-linked loans will always be 5 or 10 basis points lower than a normal loan. So the financing is there, but the banks absolutely want to finance this transition. And the Poseidon Principles banks have to finance the transition, otherwise we're not going to meet our own commitments. So we want to lend more money on greener assets. We do need a little bit of help from the central bank to give the margin decrease that the ship owners are looking for. Then of course there's the sourcing of the finance. It's not just about price, it's about sourcing. And what I heard yesterday was some fantastic presentations on equipment suppliers, and of course it's a little bit about price there as well, but sometimes it's actually providing finance for this type of company, for these type of assets. It's not all about the price, it's about actually sourcing it. And I think that's where banks can play a bigger role, can perform better. And I think that is something we could all step up now and look at the ways of entities, because they're playing such a crucial part in the True Zero.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to mention?
Yeah, maybe I can talk from a slightly different angle, and that is how do you price blended finance? How do you create a blended finance vehicle that prices this correctly? We had this excuse me, problem with the Innovation Fund, which is a fund of a pot of money which is available to the European Commission of about €1 billion a year, which is raised by the sale of excess carbon emission allowances in the European trading system. And what we did then is this particular mechanism allows innovative technologies and projects, hydrogen, CCS, could be shipping, floating wind, to bid in for this money. And we had to find a way of how do you get the absolute best value and how do you make it uniform across a number of different technologies. So we created a concept which was based on levelized costs of electricity, which is basically the way you measure how much does it cost to produce electricity from coal compared to solar. And the way it does it is basically it discounts according to what the cost of finance is and what your cost of capital, your CapEx and your OpEx is. And it discounts it and gives you a per unit price. So we did that not just for electricity, but for products. So we created a methodology that says what is your cost of product in your new technology and what's the cost of product for the market-based product. So it could be a ton of hydrogen, it could be a chemical, it could be a unit product. And we looked at that difference and said how much money based on that difference to what it's costing you to produce that product now, including the cost of finance, and then allowed companies to bid in compared to how much emissions they were reducing as a result of introducing that technology. So what we created is basically a methodology for blended finance to get the best value, squeeze the best value out of it. And it's quite complex, and people have got to do quite a lot of work to bid in to get this money, but these are big amounts of money, and you've got to be careful. So there are mechanisms to price this competitively and to price it correctly, but it takes quite a lot of work. And the Innovation Fund is one of the newer ones that does this uniformly across industries, of which shipping could theoretically be one.
And right, and maybe if we do get a carbon price and create the carbon fund where the shipping industry self-finances part of this transition itself, that could be one of the models. It's interesting how it was pointed out the Poseidon principles, that model is being looked at by other industries now, and reciprocally, we're learning from models happening elsewhere. Do we have one burning question before we either go to next panel or to coffee break? Yeah, Brent. Do we have a microphone for Brent?
I guess I have two questions for you, but the first one is, with everything that you guys are talking about right now and what you're bringing to the table in terms of, call it a combined approach to financing what we do, how important is it to incorporate governments in order to accelerate the process to having, call it a carrot and stick approach to interest rates and financing costs, to encourage adoption? Because it seems what you guys are doing is putting together a very strong collaboration of finance and finance capability and structures that are going to encourage this. But how do we encourage the ship owners and operators to adopt and help offset the cost of the technologies that are being put into this that aren't necessarily going to be environmentally or cash payback driven the same way a current vessel construction with a two-stroke engine is? I think governments need to be involved in that to support you, but I'm curious to see what you guys have to say. A second question for you, and this, Michael, goes back to your initial speech. You mentioned it's not about financing the boat, it's about financing the company that operates the boat. Now, for all of us in this room who are either in that I'm a boat or I'm a technology, what characteristics do you look for in those companies in order to justify your involvement on the financing side?
One or two. Do you want to start with Greg, or we'll go this way?
People can hear me. Oh, okay, sorry. I can't hear anything. So on the regulation side, there's always this question across any climate finance, what the carrot and what the stick is. So there needs to be a certain base regulation or a certain agreement amongst the market that you have certain goals in mind to reach. When it comes to finance, there are two components. There's the how do you reach a commercial financing proposition, maybe through blended finance or through other means. And the other one, and often maybe it's to do with regulation around banking, so central banking rules around risk weightings, for example, or capital allocation. But the other side is there's certain regulations industry regulations, which might stop things from being commercial. I'll give you a very small example. When we were looking in Fiji, one of the issues was that there aren't concessions for certain transport routes. So any operator can move in and out of that route, and it becomes very difficult for someone to buy an asset, which is a long-term asset, let's say a battery-powered ferry, and use it on a route which is going to be competed against willy-nilly by anyone. So in order to make that climate finance possible, you had to regulate and you had to change the way concessions, or you had to introduce concessions for certain routes. It hasn't happened yet, but this is one of the barriers. So there often are regulations that you need to consider, which might not be related to finance. It might more be related to the market dynamics.
Yeah. Let me answer Brent's first question. And you could spend a whole conference on that one question. What's so important is the carbon pricing, the carbon levy, whatever the market-based measures, that money, if that disappears into some government-controlled pot, it won't go anywhere near shipping. It's essential that we advocate for what is specifically raised from taxing shipping should go into a fund probably administered by, under the auspices of the IMO, administered by the World Bank, so that those funds with proper management are available to speed up the decarbonisation of shipping. If this becomes a tax on shipping through a carbon price, it's only going to slow down decarbonisation, and that's where government is very important. They hate hypothecating money, but we have to argue as the shipping industry. And it's not just the shipping industry, it goes back to the point I raised. This is about the supply chain, it's not about the ship anymore. You are all selling technologies around the ship, but the ship carries someone else's cargo and does things. It's about everything in the supply chain. So that's why we have to make that argument that decarbonising the supply chain benefits everyone, which is why any money raised from that should go into speeding up the decarbonisation.
Just following again on from Michael, I mean, the Poseidon Principles is all about transparency, and I think transparency is key. If transparent reporting of emissions from ship owners was mandatory, that would really kickstart a decarbonisation process. That may come from the carbon pricing, who knows, but if it was mandatory to transparently report all emissions, that would lead to much clarity on the sourcing of finance, and you see the winners and losers very quickly. That's my personal opinion. I think also that your second question, if I heard it, because the fan was going behind, but I think what we're looking for on corporate now is we are financing assets, but we're really financing the corporate. What is important is that from my bank's perspective, we're now looking to see at the very minimum a commitment from our ship owner clients and a strategy, a commitment to and a strategy for 2050. It has to be very clear and preferably in their sustainability report. If they haven't got a commitment or a strategy, it's highly unlikely going forwards we will support them. It's now a bare minimum.
Well,
so if,
yeah.
If I should touch on the
quickly.
First question. So I'll skip the last question, but for the first questions, from a ship owner perspective, what we are looking at every day, our ambitions and plans, they go beyond the existing regulation. So we are affected by mainly about finance, because finance comments from the new drives and new regulations that will hit finance directly will hit us indirectly. So when you see the ambitions of the taxonomy and the requirements for the banks to be to transfer that investment and transfer capital to taxonomy aligned industries and to green industries, that will hit us. So in a regulatory perspective, I think that the stronger guidance and regulations for finance will affect in the industry in a secondary, because we need to have also access to capital, and then it will drive our ambitions. Secondary, there's only one body that can regulate global shipping, and that's the IMO, and that is also a political responsibility to making sure that we have a good and ambitious regulation within IMO. And the IMO is the UN, it's the global fleet. So that means that we need to make sure that those funds and regulations that are collected through a tax system or market-based measures actually drives the green transition and going back to the industry, and not sort of into just feeding general political ambitions in all the different countries.
Thank you, Øystein. Well, do we have time for one or two more questions? Okay.
Oh.
Shoot, quick.
The cost of bringing the global fleet to net zero is going to be pretty high. The estimates I've heard vary from, say, 2 trillion to 3.5. Does that sort of range seem A, plausible, and B, well, how reachable is it?
Yes. There are two different numbers there. You're going to write this down, don't quote me. There's the number that the Getting to Zero Coalition and UMass came up with in a report a number of months ago that had, I think, 1.85 trillion. Now, with inflation, it's already 2, I suppose, of which 85% was land-based logistics and infrastructure. So that's the fuels, it's the distribution, it's all of that. And it's a very small amount for the ships themselves. There is then a separate thing which Martin Stopford, who is the distinguished shipping economist, came up with, which I think was 3.5 trillion, which was to replace the fleet. But that is over a much longer period. But I think what we should all accept is we've seen from COVID there's plenty of money available if people want to make it available. And actually, you know, once we get, that was the point I made about getting zero emission ships on the water by 2030, so that every ship owner has to order a zero emission ship from that point. There will still be retrofitted existing ships in the world fleet, and what we shouldn't be doing is building unnecessary ships using old technology. So they're not competing numbers, but until the land-based infrastructure and the alternative fuels are sort of decided in the energy transition, you know, the ships that are going to be built sooner are going to have to be adaptable to whatever those fuels are until such time as someone will make a choice between hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, or whatever the fuel that the class societies say is safe and affordable.
There's plenty of money in the system to finance the transition, but to answer your question in a different way, what concerns me is we do need to embrace that transition. The shipping industry needs external investment, not just from banks, but from institutional shareholders. And the way the EU taxonomy, for example, is drafted is very narrow. And if it's too narrow and it doesn't embrace the energy transition, these institutional shareholders will be driven to other sectors where they can place their green investment. And that concerns me, because then suddenly the figures that Michael mentions and you mention could be unreachable.
Yeah. Thomas. I'm sorry. Excuse me.
Maybe the last question, really. Paul, you mentioned transparency, and just to pick up on that point, and I know we've talked about that in the last day or so, to what extent will there be visibility in the bank's portfolios of the climate alignment of your ship owners? And secondly, you know, would that help in terms of communicating to them sort of where they are and the benefits of, for example, retrofitting or performance measures to shift their position in that picture of their alignment?
To the feedback of the results to the ship owners, yeah. So again, every signatory may act differently. What we do at SocGen is we provide feedback to every ship owner. We prepare a presentation. We'll show how their vessels on our portfolio have fared and how they fared versus the average on our portfolio. Of course, we can't show other ship owners' figures. That is confidential information, and that had to be assured before the Poseidon Principles were launched. It was the confidentiality of data that was probably the biggest concern to ship owners. So we share the information, their information, and we have an open discussion on why the figures may be as they are and compare it with market data, but we're not specific.
But we have spawned an industry of people like you, class societies and others, advising shipping companies on how to handle the outcome of the Poseidon Principles. International Seaways, actually, not long after we launched in 19, published at the end of the year their own alignment with the Poseidon Principles to show how they were performing. And I think, to Øystein's point, what companies are now doing is needing to be transparent, and those that are leading the way will set the standards. And that's why in this whole thing we worry about first movers. My view is if you're not a first mover, you're not going to be anywhere, because whether it's investors or others will avoid you. One final point. We use secured shipping. That's 80% of shipping finance. When, as Paul says, it becomes mandatory, which is not going to be difficult if people pass the laws, to publish that data, we will then move probably to a corporate level. So we'll actually then capture 100% of the shipping activity of shipping companies. The moment if you don't provide security, we don't count that. The owner who gets the benefit of unsecured financing, of which there are very few, they may well publish their emissions, but we're not counting it within the Poseidon Principles. But the world will go to reporting every business's emissions, and then we'll be able to take that data and apply it as we amend the principles over time.
All right.
If I can
Thank
If
you.
I can briefly comment on those data, sorry for if I interrupted here, but a lot of these data is actually available today, and it's open to the public as well. All the reported data we report to the EU, the MRV data, they are available. So that means that we have access to those data, and we can look into our competitors and others, and we know that a lot of institutions and analysis companies as well are using those data. So I think going forward, those data will be transparent, and I think that would be good, and it's important for us going forward to sort of have transparency and open and access to high quality data. But as I stated earlier, it's important. I think that a lot of companies are probably struggling getting high quality data. But as soon as we are starting measuring on that, I think that all financing going forward will have some kind of link to a sustainability target. And that means that the transparency to those data would be there. And as I said, we are very open about it. We report it, including with our financial performance or the quarterly reporting.
All right, so this has been great. I'm very encouraged about system change and financing that systematic change. Now, Maddie, you're going to tell us what we do next. Thank you.